Dear listeners, I ask you to listen to the story until the very end and be sure to write a review about what you liked and what needs to be changed to make it more interesting for you to listen to my stories. The basement door. We moved into the house in late September, when the air was crisp but not yet cold, and the trees on our street were just starting to blush with autumn colors. It wasn't an old mansion or one of those gothic nightmares you'd expect in a ghost story. Just a regular suburban home, a little worn down, but nothing a coat of paint and some new fixtures couldn't fix. A fixer-upper, as my wife optimistically called it. The kids were excited. New rooms to explore, a backyard twice the size of our last one, and a basement big enough to turn into a playroom. Everything seemed perfect. At least, at first. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, with that stale, slightly damp smell that most basements have. A single overhead light cast long shadows across the unfinished concrete floor. Along the back wall, a set of sturdy metal shelves held leftover paint cans, rusty tools, and things the previous owners had left behind, half a dozen old glass jars, a wooden rocking horse missing one eye, and a stack of yellowed newspapers from the 70s. But what stood out most was the door. It was massive, solid metal with thick rivets along the edges, embedded deep into the foundation as if someone had built the house around it. No knob, just a keyhole. It looked completely out of place in an ordinary family home, like something that belonged in a bank vault or a prison. I knocked on it out of curiosity. The sound that came back was deep and dull, like knocking on stone. My wife and I exchanged a glance. "Must be some kind of old storm shelter," I said, though even I didn't believe it. The realtor hadn't mentioned it. In fact, when I thought back to the walkthrough, she had conveniently skipped the basement entirely. I tried to push it open, but it didn't budge. There was no visible lock, no handle, just that keyhole, black and empty like an eye socket. Over the next few days, we asked around. Neighbors gave us vague, dismissive answers, the kind that hinted they knew more than they were saying but didn't want to get involved. "Some doors are better left closed," old Mrs. Hendricks from next door told me in a voice thick with warning. A handyman I called over just shook his head and refused to touch it. "Wouldn't mess with that," he muttered, packing up his tools faster than I'd ever seen a man move. Of course, that only made me more curious. I tried every key we had, even bought an old skeleton key set from an antique shop downtown. None of them fit. One evening, after a couple of beers, I even attempted to pick the lock with a bobby pin from my wife's drawer. The keyhole was too deep, the mechanism inside too complex. So we left it. Then, on the fourth night, it started. A sound woke me. A slow, rhythmic creaking, like an old rocking chair moving back and forth. My first thought was that one of the kids was up, but when I checked, both were sound asleep in their beds. The noise wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from below. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, hard hammering against my ribs. The house was silent now, except for the occasional groan of wood settling. I told myself I had imagined it. That old houses make weird noises. That stress and exhaustion were playing tricks on me. But the next morning, when I went down to check, my stomach turned to ice. The door was open. Not just unlocked. Not just slightly ajar. Wide open. A black, gaping hole in the wall where before there had only been cold, unyielding steel. The air inside was damp, heavy with a scent I couldn't quite place, something raw, earthy, and wet, like soil after a fresh rain. And on the concrete floor, leading out from the darkness, were footprints. Bare. Wet. Human. And they led straight up the stairs. I woke up gasping for air, my heart hammering so violently I thought it might rip through my ribs. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, thick, like something was holding its breath alongside me. My throat was dry, and my skin was cold with sweat. I strained my ears, waiting, hoping I had only imagined it. But then I heard it again, the unmistakable creak of the basement door shifting ever so slightly. I had locked it. I was sure I had locked it. Before going to bed, I had checked it 3 times, twisting the knob, pulling at it, making sure it was sealed shut. But now, in the thick blackness of the night, it was moving on its own. A slow, agonizing groan of metal against wood, like something testing its boundaries, trying to ease its way into the house. I didn't want to get up. Every muscle in my body screamed to stay under the covers, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. Not with that sound. Not with the weight of the unknown pressing against my skull, making my breath come short and uneven. I had to see it for myself. Sliding out of bed, I stepped onto the cold floor, my skin prickling as I crept toward the door. The hallway stretched ahead of me in dim, eerie shadows cast by the moon filtering through the old windows. Everything seemed distorted, elongated, as if the walls had shifted in my sleep. The air felt different, charged, heavier. My bare feet made no sound as I moved, and I found myself holding my breath as I approached the basement door. It was open. Not wide, just a sliver, a dark gap barely an inch thick, but enough. Enough to know that something had been here. The air seeping through was different, damp, carrying a faint, musty smell that hadn't been there before. My hand trembled as I reached out, pushing against the old wood, and the hinges screamed in protest as the door swung open fully. The basement stairs loomed ahead, a steep descent into utter blackness. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I should have turned back. I should have slammed the door shut and walked away. But my body acted on its own, compelled by something deeper than fear. I took a step forward. The wooden stairs creaked beneath me, each groan of the old boards echoing into the abyss below. My breath was ragged, my pulse a deafening drum in my ears. Halfway down, I hesitated, gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles ached. And then, from the bottom of the basement, I heard it. A wet, deliberate step. Not a creak of the house settling. Not a trick of my mind. A footstep. I froze, my entire body paralyzed with terror. The sound of something moving down there, slow, patient. Another step. And another. The squelching sound of bare feet pressing into the concrete floor. Then silence. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only stand there, my hands ice-cold against the railing, my mind racing through every possible explanation, none of which made sense. The darkness ahead seemed deeper now, more tangible, as if it were watching me back. And then, from the shadows, something shifted. A whisper of movement. A shape too indistinct to fully register. But it was there. And it was waiting. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, some cruel trick of the mind born from exhaustion and paranoia. But the wet footprints on the basement floor were real. Even in the dim light that barely reached beyond the staircase, I could see them, dark, irregular patches glistening on the cold concrete. They weren't there before. I was sure of it. And worse, they weren't leading toward the basement door. They were leading away from it. As if something had walked out. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I forced myself to stay still, to listen, to make sense of the unnatural quiet pressing in from all sides. The air was heavy, thick with dampness, carrying a faint scent of something old, something that didn't belong. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to run back upstairs, to pretend I had never seen any of this. But my legs wouldn't move. My fingers gripped the railing so tightly I could feel the rusted metal biting into my skin. I should have turned back. I should have left. But instead, I took another step forward, and that was when I heard it, a sound so faint, so impossibly soft, it sent an electric current of terror through my veins. A breath. Not mine. Not the subtle shifting of the house or the wind outside. A deep, slow inhale, as if something was standing just beyond my line of sight, hidden in the thick blackness of the basement, watching me. I sucked in a sharp breath and stumbled back, my shoulder colliding with the wall as I scrambled to regain my footing. My hand shot out, grasping at the doorframe, and I was about to slam it shut when a sudden chill rushed past me. Not a draft. Not the natural coolness of an old house. This was something else. Something unseen brushing against my skin, the undeniable sensation of movement, of presence, of something walking past me. The door didn't resist when I shoved it closed with all my strength, and for a brief moment, I stood there, my back pressed against the wood, my heart hammering so loudly I thought it might shake the walls. The silence stretched on, thick and unnatural, broken only by my ragged breathing. I didn't hear footsteps retreating back into the basement. I didn't hear the door creak as if something had tried to push back. Nothing. And then, from behind me, from the hallway leading to the bedrooms, I heard a soft drip, drip, drip. My stomach twisted as I turned, the dim light casting long, jagged shadows along the floorboards. At first, I saw nothing. Just the familiar hallway, the framed pictures on the walls, the slightly ajar doors leading to my children's rooms. But then my eyes dropped to the floor, and my breath caught in my throat. Wet footprints. Bare. Human. Leading from the basement door, stretching down the hall. Leading straight to my daughter's room. Panic surged through me, a white-hot wave of terror that shattered whatever paralysis had held me moments ago. I ran, my feet slipping on the damp wood as I followed the trail, my hands shaking so violently I barely managed to push open her door. My mind was racing, already preparing for the worst, for the unimaginable horror that awaited me. The room was dark, only the pale glow of the street lamp outside casting faint patterns against the walls. My daughter was there, curled beneath the blankets, her breath slow and steady, undisturbed. Relief crashed over me, but it was short-lived. Because as I stepped closer, as I leaned down to check on her, my eyes landed on something that froze the air in my lungs. The closet door. Opened just a crack. And inside that sliver of darkness, just barely visible, two pale, wet footprints on the wooden floor. The rational part of my mind begged me to turn on the light, to flood the room with something, anything, that would shatter the suffocating weight of that darkness pressing in from the closet. But some deeper, primal instinct screamed that I shouldn't. That if I did, if I exposed whatever was in there to the light, I would see it. And I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to know what shape lurked in that shadowed crack, what thing had left its damp, human-shaped prints trailing across my home. But standing there, frozen in place, wasn't an option either. My daughter shifted in her sleep, the soft rustling of her blankets impossibly loud against the crushing silence, and I forced my body to move, to act, to protect her. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the closet door, my fingers hesitating just before they touched the wood. The air was different here, thicker, colder, carrying a scent that made my skin prickle with unease. Not just damp, but something older, something wrong. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to grip the door's edge. My pulse throbbed in my ears, each beat deafening, drowning out rational thought. And then, in one swift motion, I yanked it open. Nothing. No figure looming in the darkness, no grotesque shape hunched in the corner. Just my daughter's neatly hung clothes, her scattered toys on the floor, and the unsettling emptiness that felt far too intentional, as if something had just been there, waiting, only to slip away the moment I forced it into the open. But my relief was short-lived, because as I stepped back, my bare foot landed in something wet. A fresh print. Right behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance, my breath strangled in my throat, but the room was still, unchanged. My daughter sighed in her sleep, shifting beneath the blankets, unaware of the growing horror unraveling around her. My gaze dropped to the floor, to the faint outline of moisture disappearing into the wood, proof that something had stood directly behind me only seconds ago. My body was trembling, not from the cold but from the sheer, nauseating certainty that I was no longer alone in my own home, that something had stepped out of the basement, out of the dark, and was still here. I needed to get out of that room. I needed to get my daughter and leave, to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever unseen thing had invaded our space. But just as I reached down to scoop her up, a sound stopped me. A whisper. Faint, almost too soft to be real, curling through the air like a breath of wind through old leaves. It wasn't coming from the closet anymore. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the baby monitor sitting on the nightstand. At first, I thought it was just static, the usual faint hum of white noise that filled the house late at night. But then it came again, clearer this time, unmistakably human. A voice. A single word, drawn out in a slow, deliberate hush. SHHHH. My entire body locked up, muscles rigid with terror, because that voice wasn't mine. It wasn't my husband's. And it sure as hell wasn't my daughter's. The air in the room seemed to shift, the atmosphere pressing in like a weight against my chest, suffocating, electric. I grabbed the monitor with a shaking hand, my thumb instinctively pressing the button to speak. My voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Who's there?" Silence. Not even the usual soft breaths of my sleeping daughter came through. Just an unnatural, heavy stillness stretching between me and whatever was on the other end of that monitor. I wanted to believe it was a malfunction, interference from another signal, some bizarre technical glitch. But then, just as I was about to switch it off, the whisper returned. This time, closer. This time, right against my ear, though the monitor was still in my hand. "I see you." The voice wasn't just coming from the monitor anymore. It was coming from behind me. Every muscle in my body clenched, my breath trapped somewhere between my ribs and my throat, a primal instinct shrieking at me to run. But I couldn't. Not yet. My daughter was still in the crib, still oblivious, still lying there in the thick, unnatural silence that had settled over the room like a fog. The weight of unseen eyes pressed into my back, the air behind me thick with something I couldn't see but could feel, a presence, a pressure, an unnatural awareness bearing down on me, waiting. Slowly, so slowly it felt like my limbs were moving through molasses, I turned my head, just enough to glance over my shoulder, expecting, dreading, to see something standing inches from me. But the space behind me was empty. No figure, no shape, nothing but the dim glow of the hallway stretching beyond the doorway. And yet, the presence remained, hanging in the air, filling the space where something unseen should have been. My fingers tightened around the baby monitor, my knuckles white, my pulse thundering so violently in my ears that I almost didn't hear it at first, the faint, wet sound of something moving against the floor. Not footsteps. Dragging. A slow, deliberate slide, like bare skin pulling across hardwood, shifting just outside the room, out of sight. I knew in that moment that if I looked into the hallway, if I saw what was making that sound, I wouldn't be able to move. That whatever was out there, whatever had spoken to me through the monitor, wanted me to see it. Wanted me to step forward, to lean just an inch too far into the darkness. To acknowledge it. I refused. I turned instead to my daughter, scooping her up in one swift, desperate motion. She stirred but didn't wake, her small body warm against my chest, unaware of the thing slithering unseen through our home. My legs felt unsteady as I backed away from the crib, my breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts, my ears straining for any sound, any movement. The hallway yawned before me, stretching out into the kind of blackness that felt too deep, like something was waiting to reach out and swallow me whole the second I stepped across the threshold. But I had no choice. I had to get out. I had to. A whisper curled through the darkness, sliding past my ear like a breath of cold wind, impossibly close. Going somewhere? I didn't think. I ran. I bolted through the hallway, my bare feet pounding against the floor, my daughter clutched so tightly against me that I could feel the rapid rise and fall of her tiny chest. The air behind me felt wrong, warping, twisting, something following, not with footsteps, but with that sick, dragging sound, faster now, chasing, reaching. I hit the stairs so hard I nearly lost my balance, stumbling forward, gripping the banister to keep from tumbling down. The baby monitor slipped from my grasp, clattering against the steps, the static-filled speaker crackling as it tumbled, landing somewhere below. And then... laughter. Soft. Amused. Not human. It rose from the monitor in bursts, distorted, warping, as if something inside the device was trying to crawl its way out. I didn't stop. I didn't look. I tore down the stairs, my only thought escape, my mind shoving down the horror of whatever had whispered into my ear, whatever had left wet footprints in my daughter's room, whatever was still coming. I reached the front door, fumbling with the lock, my fingers numb with panic. It wouldn't turn. The knob wouldn't turn. The laughter from the monitor stopped. And then, slowly, methodically, something knocked on the inside of the closet door behind me. Once. Twice. 3 times. And then, from the depths of the baby monitor, a voice, calm and cold, whispered. "Too late."